First, welcome all of you again to Congregation Shared Israel, America's synagogue, America's first congregation. I want to thank all of the speakers who spoke before. First, to our Parnas, Louis Solomon, for his extraordinary leadership and for his friendship and for all that he does for our synagogue. I want to welcome the distinguished Rabbanim who are here. On a personal note, so wonderful first to have Rabbi Lamb back here with us at Shared Israel. It's always our joy. I want to welcome my previous boss and teacher, Rabbi Haskell-Luxty, who not only in the true sign of respect for Rabbi Genack has been willing to come to the west side to join us here. Rabbi Rabbi Shechter, many other distinguished Rabbanim. Welcome. I want to thank Professor Holter. Professor Holter, if you want, after our discussion, I can take you down to my office and I can show you actually an elegy that this community wrote sometime before Lincoln's death, mourning the path. This is an actual Hebrew elegy that we wrote, mourning the passing of William Henry Harrison. Nowadays, who doesn't remember where they were when William Henry Harrison caught hypothermia and died at his inauguration? Also want to thank Professor Holter for reminding us of the central thesis from Genack, I think we can all agree, which is that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. This is first of all, I'm here first and foremost to burnish my bipartisan bona fides. That's why I'm here. So I want to thank you for the opportunity. Senator Lieberman, it's wonderful. It's an honor to have you and your wife here with us again. I want to wish you a mazel tov on the birth of your grandson. I want to thank you for naming him after me. We know that you'll get a lot of joy from young Meir, or as he's already being known, Sally Jr. And we hope to see you. We hope to see you here again. And want to welcome all of you to what is an extraordinary evening, celebrating an extraordinary book, a book that is really sui generis. I am, like Rabbi Genack, an American history aficionado, and I have never seen a book like this. Rabbi Genack's relationship with President Clinton brings to mind other distinguished Jewish scholars in our history who have had a relationship with and an impact on powerful leaders of various lands. And perhaps first and foremost, it brings to mind the story of the book of Esther, in which we find both Esther and Mordechai and the impact that they had on the land in Shushan Habira. And it's my father who pointed out to me once that Megillat Esther, as the Talmud notes, is described in two ways. It is on the one hand called an Igeret, it is called a letter. And on the other hand, it is called a Sefer, it is called a book. My father pointed out to me that the experiences of reading a letter and reading a Sefer are fundamentally different. When you read a letter, you are getting a personal front row seat to something new and exciting. When you are reading a Sefer is a book. It is something that has significance, not just for the here and now, but for many generations to come. Rabbi Genack has taken his letters discussing Divrei Torah from himself and many, many other distinguished rabbis, intellectuals, and politicians, and the impact that has had on President Clinton, and made those letters now as part of the book. It is simultaneously an extraordinary collection of igrot, of letters which take us behind the scenes to the 1990s, brings us back to those tumultuous times, and especially 1998 and 1999, and all that was going on at that time. At the same time, it is also not just an extraordinary collection of igrot of letters, but also a wonderful sefer, a book of Divrei Torah that will stand the test of time and inspire many who read it, not just now, but for generations to come. As someone who had the great zechut of being Rabbi Genack's student at Yeshiva University. And to add on a personal note, as someone whose family has received much love and kindness from Rabbi Genack, it's my great privilege to ask all of you to join me again in welcoming Rabbi Genack. Now, Rabbi Genack, let's begin by talking about the real subject of the book, which is not actually your friendship with President Clinton, but it's the Bible. The book is filled with Divrei Torah, which happened to be part of a correspondence with an American president. Now, this American president was raised a Southern Baptist, and one of the most striking things in my experience of Protestant, especially evangelical, Southern Baptist, etc., is their incredible knowledge of the Tanakh. A knowledge that, at least in English, can put Jews to shame, put Orthodox Jews to shame. We have many different genres that we have to study. We have Talmud, we have Medrash, we have Chumash, etc. For the Protestants, this is what they had, and they love it, and they cherish it as the Word of God, and they commit it to memory, and it's inscribed in their hearts and on their souls. Now, can Bill Clinton's knowledge of the Bible, in your experience, put most Jews to shame? And do you think that's linked to his background?
I think some of these letters demonstrate the president's extraordinary knowledge of the Bible. I'm just going to tell two stories in the book. I don't know if Josh Gottheimer is here. If Josh Gottheimer is here, but he was a speechwriter for President. Oh, Josh is here. For President Clinton, and he told me a story about his own experience. He once drafted a speech for the president, and he quoted a verse from the New Testament, I think it was, and the president, he corrected the citation. He knew the different translations, King James or the Standard Translation. So I had that experience. One of the letters that I wrote, which I guess we'll talk about later on, about Judah and Joseph. And the question is, why was Judah chosen ultimately for kingship? One would have thought that Joseph was perfectly suited for the job. After all, that's certainly what Jacob thought, giving him the Xonus Massif, multicolored coat. And I quoted Rabbi Soloveitchik from saying that the reason Judah is chosen is because he's able to admit mistake. And it's a little prescient, obviously, at the time that I wrote it. I didn't know what was going to happen, but this was about Judah. I said about Judah and Tamar, how Judah admits a mistake. And when I wrote it, my daughter typed it. My daughter Tammy was here, and she wrote Genesis 28. Well, I got a note from the president correcting the citation, Genesis 38. And Marty, who's a distinguished Christian theologian at university, or Christian historian at the University of Chicago, told me that he was once in a meeting with the president with a whole bunch of Christian theologians. I tried to get, prominent Christian evangelicals, to give me a blurb on the book. But, I had to first get somebody who thought that, Bill Clinton was involved in killing Vince Forster, so it wasn't easy to get the blurb. But he was at this meeting, and, Protestants from every stream and Catholics, and one of them, a very prominent evangelical, said, "Mr. President, I've been praying for you." And the president said, "Well, what have you been praying?" So he cited a verse, he said, from Chronicles 1. And Clinton corrected him. I believe that's in Chronicles 2. And of course, Bill Clinton was right. Now, just for those who don't know, Chronicles is Divrei Hayomim. How many people in this room have ever opened up Divrei Hayomim? So, obviously it's part of his background, but, it's not unique. I think, Abraham Lincoln, as we know, who himself, I'm reticent to say anything about Abraham Lincoln, I haven't posed his presence, but Abraham Lincoln himself, as a young man, was a scoffer. He wrote a book which his friends, one essay, told him to burn, questioned the divinity of the Bible. His wife, Mary, said that technically he wasn't a Christian, but he was very inspired by the Bible. And once his friend Joshua Speed came to visit him, and he saw Lincoln reading the Bible, very engrossed in the Bible. And he said, essentially, kind of, what are you wasting your time? And Lincoln said, everything you have to know, something to that effect, is in this book. So, you know, there is a tradition of, you know, of knowing the Bible. Lincoln often cites the Bible in the Second Inaugural and in many, many places. So, and Lincoln didn't have many books. The Bible was something that he read often, and you can see the biblical cadence in many of his speeches. So, in terms of Bill Clinton, the Bible was important to him. He writes in his memoir that during the difficult times of the impeachment, he would often go back to his office and read the Bible for hours. And Lincoln did the same thing. So obviously the Bible is important to him. There's no question the Southern Baptist tradition, you know, inspired him in that respect, even though ideologically he wasn't exactly Southern Baptist.
How did this start? How did you key into this great interest in the Bible that he had? You mentioned that you said one part Torah, and then you had come. Right.
Well, it began. There was an event for Bill Clinton, and when he was then Governor Clinton running for president, and I introduced him, and I said, you know, at the time, George Bush first, you know, was having what was called this problem with the vision thing. Time magazine had an article about it, and so in my introduction, I said that vision is a critical dimension of leadership. And the Bible tells us, from Mishnah, from Proverbs, when there is no vision, the people perish. And afterwards, he came up to me and said, you know, I like that introduction. I think I'm going to use that in my acceptance speech at the convention. I wasn't sure if he was serious enough, but he sent me some tickets to the convention. And lo and behold, it became sort of a rhetorical pivot of his speech. When there is no vision, the people perish, and then he would come back to it. You know, I remember when he began his acceptance speech, if you remember, everybody wrote, you know, the obituary of this young governor's, political obituary after he gave the keynote address at the Democratic Convention 4 years earlier. And because he had gone on much too long, and when he began his...
When he said in conclusion...
And that began to... But when he began his speech, my speech, you know, he...
now we know the difference, we know what's changed.
When he began, he said, you know, I always wanted to finish that speech I started 4 years ago.
So now we know the actual source of the change. As one would expect from Divrei Torah to a president, many of them are about leadership. So let's spend a little time talking about leadership traits. You're clearly, I know this long before the book, you're clearly very taken with Bill Clinton's mind. I think you may have told me that he's one of the smartest people you've ever met. Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes said about FDR that he had a second-rate intellect, but a first-class temperament. The point being that brilliance is not essential to great leadership. One of my own favorite figures in American history is John Quincy Adams, an amazing man, an evil man, I think we would call him. Probably the most brilliant man to ever be in the White House, but utterly ineffectual as president. So, do you actually think that great intellect is an essential trait of leadership? And maybe, speaking about that, maybe comment as well on your own experience of Bill Clinton's mind.
I just want to correct what Abraham Lincoln was our most brilliant president. John Quincy. John Adams.
Great man. We disagree on that.
I rarely agree with anything that Newt Gingrich says, but I listened to a lecture they gave, because I listened to all these lectures, I listened to the video, and he said that...
You were listening to a lecture by Newt Gingrich?
That some scientists...
This is the most exciting thing I've ever seen.
But he said that, he was speaking about Lincoln, that Lincoln was on to be president. Listen, I think when, Haynesworth was appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, so, and the people questioned his
right.
So I think it was Senator, was it Russell from Nebraska, said that, mediocrity should also be represented on the court.
And yet, of course, it looks like America.
Right, of course, it looks like America. Mediocrity might be even shooting high. But, obviously, if a person, it's not the only quality, but a person with really good, it's not just intelligence, it's not just doing well on IQ, it's having, that plus political instincts and political genius. So Lincoln, who was our only president to actually have a patent in his name, but Lincoln had two things. It was also this extraordinary political genius, which a lot of people learned about it when they saw that movie Lincoln, which Harold also was an advisor to. But the other quality, so having a really brilliant mind has got to be a good asset. Now, it's not the only quality of leadership, and it doesn't guarantee success. The other qualities, in terms of empathy and political genius, is not always exactly coextensive with genius in terms of taking an exam. Those people who have both, I think, have a really, a leg up.
So he had political genius.
Tremendous political genius and instincts. And also I thought about Bill Clinton, during this period of the impeachment, I thought, the stamina, to keep going, was, I thought, extraordinary. The tenacity, and those are qualities that you need. And also, ultimately, I guess, was good character.
Yeah, that's right. So now, you and I are both, as I said, American history aficionados. I think it's safe to say we've all seen already how you revere Lincoln. I think he's the most brilliant president. You might even think he's our most good-looking president. I don't know.
I would think except Lincoln for otherwise.
Yeah, probably.
Lincoln famously said, when Douglas accused him of being two-faced for giving a different speech in northern Illinois, and so he'd say, if I had another face, would I be wearing this one?
Let me quote from one letter to President Clinton that he enjoyed. You wrote about Lincoln. You wrote, quote, his sense of God fostered in him a great degree of humility, a belief that he did not control events, but rather that events controlled him. That he was not the captain of the ship, but rather a sailor, dealing with whatever storms and waves were sent his way, end quote. Surely, the source of Lincoln's greatness is that he did shape events and utilize the power of the executive in a way unlike any president before him. The most famous line from the recent Lincoln movie, which is great, where Lincoln says, you see Lincoln bullying congressmen into voting for the 13th Amendment, and he says, in the film, he says, I am the President of the United States, clothed with immense power, and I expect you to procure those votes. That actually happened. He said that. 23 years later, a congressman remembered Lincoln. He was so scared telling him that. Now, your own Rabbi, Rabbi Soloveitchik, wrote of the tension between majesty and humility within man. So how can humility and power go hand in hand in leadership? And then separately, did you see humility in President Clinton?
Well, in terms of, one of the remarkable qualities of Abraham Lincoln was his humility. And I just listened to a lecture this Tuesday by Harold Holzer and James McPherson about the Battle of Vicksburg. And Harold Holzer ended the lecture by citing Lincoln's letter to Grant. He had two letters. The one he admonishing me, which he never mailed about him, that he didn't finish Lee off after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the letter that he wrote to Grant. And in that letter, he writes to Grant, and he says, when you went north, I thought you should go south, and going through the different campaign. And I must acknowledge that you were right and I was wrong. So, that ability just to see the facts and to acknowledge it. Lincoln said in the most famous speech in American history, which is the Gettysburg Address, he said the greatest speech was the second inaugural, but the most famous was the Gettysburg Address. And he said, the world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. This he said in the most famous speech. So clearly there was a dimension of really profound humility in Lincoln, and I think the humility doesn't mean that he didn't realize that he was a man with great potential ability, and ambition. Humility, I think, because, there's a famous Gemara. The Gemara says that Rabbi said, when the Gemara tells us that there was a period when humility was lost. So Rabbi said, don't say humility is lost, that there's no one in possession of it, because I'm still alive. Now, those two statements seem to be, because I think humility means, in this context, in the leader, recognizing that the things, it's not about you. There are things beyond you. There's a sense of mission. And that's why the greatest leader in human history, Moses, the Torah tells us, was the most humble of people. Adam we call Adam. Because he had a shlichus, he had a mission. It was a divine mission. He spoke directly to God. The more ego that was in it, the less he could fulfill his mission. So in sense of perspective, I was listening today to Governor Christie's, his very long press conference. I didn't listen to the whole thing. But the thing that struck me about it, we can speak about this offline, but the thing that struck me was...
Be careful, Menachem, he may not let you back over the bridge.
For 4 days, I had a lot of difficulty getting over that bridge. It was, this person, he was struck that, his aide, or she, lied to him, they lied to him. I thought the message should have been another one. What about all the people who inconvenienced and actually maybe even put into danger? So it's that, it's not about me, the great leader. It's about the mission, about the purpose. And that's, I think, what, where the humility comes in. So Lincoln was a humble person. Now, coming back to Bill Clinton, I saw that about Bill Clinton also. There was a tremendous generosity of spirit, even people who were his tormentors, he was, he could deal with them, obviously was angry at them, but it wasn't about him. And because it's not only about him, he wasn't insulated and isolated. And I think that's very important for a leader, not only because he has to be, one of the people, to have a sense of it, but also to take, to be able to listen to what other people say. Ultimately, he has to make the decision. But, I think Bill Clinton's a person who's interested in public policy because people interest him. I tell a story in the book that, this book is, I think, a testament to his intellectual curiosity. I tell a story that when he first became president, if you remember, the first 100 days was just a disaster. Everybody predicted this another failed presidency. And he was having a lot of difficulty getting his economic program to Congress. It only passed by one vote. Al Gore always used to say, when I vote, we win. So anyhow, he was inviting different delegations for different states to come to the White House. And Al Gore, I remember, he made a presentation about, this most arcane way of figuring out taxing with BTUs. He was the only one who understood it. But when the White House aide asked me, called and asked me to come, so it happened that the day, the first it was supposed to be Tisha B'Av. So I told him, I'd really love to come, but if I come, I'd have to come in my sneakers. And then he said, why? And I explained, Tisha B'Av is the day, commemorates the day of the destruction of the temple. We mourn, we don't wear shoes. So he said, I hope you don't come. The president's going to see you wearing sneakers. He's going to ask why you're wearing sneakers. You're going to talk about the destruction of the temple. He's chronically late all the time. Maybe don't come. But anyway, my mazel was that the meeting was postponed a week or two. So, this extraordinary curiosity, and thinking that curiosity is also a function of humility. All the answers are not within me. And, some have criticized President Obama that he's too insulated and isolated, and he makes decisions, you've got to listen to other voices. And I think that's a quality that Clinton has that's very commendable.
As you note several times throughout the book, a great many of the Divrei Torah in this book, perhaps 50%, were sent to the president during 1998, 1999, the worst years of his presidency. And so it's...
what was going on?
Yeah, not much. And so it's not a coincidence that many of your missives here contain reflections on leaders who faltered and failed, as well as an entire section on teshuvah, on repentance. So let's talk a little bit about that. Many of the people who wrote words of Torah to the President for you, when they chose a paradigm of leadership from the Tanakh, they would select Yosef, Moshe, right, Yoshua. But you wrote about the paradigm of leadership being Judah. And the reason for that is, you write that, as you mentioned, Judah is chosen for the kingship because he's able to admit a mistake. Now you know further that the word Yehudah itself means admit, lahodot, adding that, according to the Talmud, you're writing this in the letter to the president. According to the Talmud, Judah is chosen by God to be the forebearer of the Davidic dynasty when he admits his relationship with Tamar. End quote. Now this was 1996, you wrote this. Now, 2 years later, this was more than relevant. How do you think Yehudah is embodied in that one moment when confronted with the sin, right? Tzadka mimeni. And as his descendant David, right, as well. Right? He just Chatatzi la Hashem, right, exactly. So how do you think Bill Clinton did when it came to the Yehudah test?
As part of this, I mean, obviously, in certain respects, he didn't do so well. But it depends, really, in the context. I mean, I have a pretty strong feeling about this. I thought that, not that I'm a constitutional expert, but the notion that, what happened with the Lewinsky scandal represented high crimes and misdemeanors was absurd, and that it was politically motivated. And that when you look back, just in terms of his accusers, Newt Gingrich, Livingston, Henry Hyde, who had to admit to a, youthful, indiscretion, Congressman Burton, one can only be struck by, the hypocrisy of the challenge. That doesn't mean I don't mean to say that what the president did was not profoundly inappropriate. It was. So, in terms of his admitting, I don't know what the right thing would be never to involve in that kind of a relationship. But caring, in many respects, a very great man. I didn't mean to say he was a biblical figure, that is true. So, a lot of these things were, political overlay in terms of this. So, he had asked me, just in terms of political advice, I think I mentioned this in the book, but I was actually a little surprised when I remember my daughter had just gotten engaged, my daughter Shira, and I told him my daughter got engaged, and he said, he couldn't believe it, you have a daughter that's engaged, what's going to be with Chelsea, something like that. And then he told me, he said, this must have been right before, right after he spoke to the Star's grand jury, gave testimony, and he said, if I speak to the nation, what should I say? So there was political advice that I gave him. I said, you're responsible for both his best political speech and, But I said, Mr. President, you always speak about also, presidents also have a right of privacy, and I think Senator Lieberman and I agree and disagree a little bit about that, but I think presidents have to recognize leaders, their position is unique, and there's a standard that is expected of them, which in this respect, obviously, the president didn't live up to. But there are also limits in terms of, personal privacy, and because what I tried to demonstrate with the Medrash is that privacy is not just privacy is not a right. it's an existential need. It's what makes us a human. It's what makes civilization possible. And if it's completely eroded, and especially nowadays with the media and the internet, it's difficult to function. So, but I did say, profound loss also. But so how did he do in the Lewinsky story? He could have done a lot better. But the lot better wouldn't have been, the statements after. The lot would have been with the good judgment and what's proper before.
If I'm going to sort of push a little bit more on the question of public versus private, you have a piece in there that was written by Rabbi Steinsaltz. It's in the book that was sent to President Clinton, where he asked why did the sins of Shaul HaMelech lead to his losing the monarchy, whereas the sins of David HaMelech did not. And he wrote that, in his words, he said, the answer lies in the fact that David's sins were private. They were individual shortcomings. On the public plane, David did not allow for personal weaknesses to interfere with what was good for the people. That was his piece. And the piece was actually written June 11, 1998, so it was during the Starr grand jury, so it's no coincidence. And the question is this true? I mean, this is, as you mentioned, a notable machloket, right, between this author and another author, he wrote with Senator Lieberman, who in his famous Senate floor speech said, quote, whether we think it's fair or not, the reality is that a president's private life is public. It's true that David HaMelech himself, right, may not have lost the kingship, but as a result of what he did, his children rebelled against him, and what he experienced was greater embarrassment than I think we'd say President Clinton experienced. David Gergen, who served Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Clinton, and reflecting on that, he said that Nixon and Clinton were the two most gifted presidents that he had served in the past 30 years. But he felt that his lesson in different respects, he's not comparing the two, just saying in different respects, he felt that the lesson he learned is that before mastering the world, a leader must achieve self-mastery. So this is especially considering your own role model, Lincoln, who himself struggled with emotional demons at times. How do you think character, private life, should be used in evaluating a president and a leader?
I think character is an essential ingredient of a great leader. I mean, when we, coming back to Lincoln, when we think about Lincoln, I've taught my children this many times. I think I might have mentioned the book. I tell them, if you want to read a good Muslim sefer, it means a good book about ethics, read a biography of Lincoln. And Lincoln, wedded to this extraordinary political genius, was a man of great character and empathy. I hasten to add, Lincoln is sui generis, no one, of course, Lincoln. But, so in certain respects, in terms of, and I think Senator Lieberman would agree with me, that in certain respects, in terms of character, the certain dimensions of character that I think are very, very important in terms of leadership. One is caring, empathy, and also, and that's what, that's a quality I've seen about President, Clinton. In this new book that Gates wrote, so he says that he never saw, I think maybe he says once, that he never saw Obama cry, he never saw tears in his eyes. And I thought that was a terrible condemnation, this sense of, there's a certain coldness there. I don't know Obama, obviously, but and in terms of President Clinton and other great presidents, I think there was a certain empathy for other people, and you really wanted to move the nation forward, and it's very much demonstrated in his post-presidency. And I've been with Clinton many, many times. I remember if you would mention Yitzhak Rabin's name to Clinton, it would always bring tears to his eyes, invariably. And because I think there was this tremendous warmth. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but that warmth can get you. into a lot of trouble also. But, so, you know, in terms of his character, I could consider President Clinton a man of very good character, a good person, a caring person, a person of great generosity of spirit, a person who can make really big mistakes, I mean ethical mistakes as well, I don't mean to say just political mistakes. But you know, what we have to do is when we judge everybody, as God judges us, is I actually have this as one of the letters that I told, you know, God judges us on a scale, at least according to our tradition, but not just us, all of humanity, the entire world. And, you know, we have to keep this balance. What's more, the debits or the assets? And that's something just in general, political culture nowadays, you know. There's no, you know, there's an attempt, I'm not talking about Clinton, but, you know, to tear people down, not to see the good in them, and not to find, you know, divine measure. If you want to read, I'll tell you which is my favorite letter. You should read Joe Lieberman's letter to President Clinton.
Night and Day.
Night and Day. It's, you know, and
I didn't mention it because I plan to use it in a sermon later, actually.
So I don't want to steal the sermon.
I don't want anybody to hear it.
But Senator Lieberman asks, I think, a very basic question. It says, you know, the Jewish day begins, as the Bible's day begins, night and day. The Erev Vivok, there was night and there was day. And even in colonial times, the Christian Sabbath began in those days, in night. So, you know, Senator Lieberman asked, why night? Shouldn't the beginning of day begin with positive? Night is the negation of light, not with the darkness. So he offers the answer, I think, very beautifully, that you can't appreciate the gifts, God's gifts that gives the day, unless you first experience the adversity, which is what night represents. And that night and the day, the dawn, represents the possibility for redemption and repentance based on the Medrash. Bill Clinton wrote about it in a letter handwritten. He said, "Dear Joe, thanks for your thoughts about, your reflections about night and day, sin and redemption. We should all be thinking about that. Nobody more than me."
This is a closing question. This is surely, as Senator Lieberman mentioned himself, it's an only in America story, this book. Rabbi Sachs notes himself that when he would share the Great Torah with Prime Minister Blair, that was done in private, his spokesman famously said, Prime Minister Blair's spokesman said, famously when asked about Blair's religion, he said, "We don't do God." Clearly it's different here. You mentioned at the beginning of your book the story of when Don Drysdale pitched for Sandy Koufax on Yom Kippur. And the Dodgers got hammered. And Walter Alston, I think it was, went up to relieve Don Drysdale, and Don Drysdale said, "Hey Skip, bet you wish I was Jewish today too." This is a book that's written, it's both for Jews but for non-Jews as well. This is I'm sorry?
I hope so. More non-Jews than Jews.
More than right, exactly.
It's marketing.
Good. So the whole thing was a marketing mindfuck, I see, that's what you're saying. Okay. But the truth is,
Bob, is at work, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, not there yet. No, okay. Maybe if you get the mitzvah text to sell this for you, you'll be all set.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, working on it. But this is, it is an only in America story. That's my favorite quote, actually. The Yogi Berra. Maybe I heard this somewhere, but the Yogi Berra quote when he was told the mayor of Dublin was Jewish. He said, "The mayor of Dublin is Jewish only in America," right? So, what do you think your story, your friendship with President Clinton, your Torah correspondence with an American president, one that, to my knowledge, is unparalleled. What should that tell both Jews and non-Jews about America? And what do you hope the Jews and non-Jews will do about this book?
You know, that story with Don Drysdale and, you know, Sandy Koufax not pitching on Shabbos, there was a parade at the White House. And anyhow, Clinton asked me, he called me to say something, and this was right after, I think they announced that Senator Lieberman was going to be the nominee. So I told the story about that, and I said that I thought that President Clinton, the openness that he represented, helped to create that climate and that environment to make, this wonderful nomination possible. Of course, Al Gore's being Joe Lieberman's Shabbos lawyer for a long period was also helpful, paved the way. But I think one of the things that animate this book is something that you touched, and that is a sense of gratitude as an American Jew to the United States of America. And we should never forget that, especially based on the founding documents, America is the greatest enterprise for good in the history of the world. And and America is, I think Archibald Police wants it, America is always still becoming. And I think President Clinton's openness and demonstrated, but I can tell you many stories, many people had this experience. That's what America is. So I meant this to be also, praise for the great country that we live on. Dan Lou, I just see him looking at the other side. Danny is Jack Lou's son, So when we just look around, the Jews who come to prominence in American government, but it's not just that, that we're able, America's beginning to be able to shed some of its demons, which is represented, its ugly history of racism, first American black president. I think that was part of the subtext of this book.
Well, as the 10th Minister of Shared Israel since the American Revolution, I want to thank you for allowing us at Shared Israel to join you in celebrating with you this historic occasion, this historic book this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. You're all invited downstairs for refreshments and the book signing. Thank you very much.